So you put the phone on the other one.
Yeah.
And we can get cutaways.
Ah, how sophisticated. This is very modern. You sure you don't want to have a Polaroid camera as well?
Today, I am joined by none other than Lord Dr. Michael Hastings of Scarisbrick CBE. Now, aside from being the former Global Head of Citizenship at KPMG, former trustee of the Vodafone Group Foundation and former head of public or head of affairs at the BBC, Lord Hastings is Chancellor of Regent's University here in London. He is Vice President at UNICEF, President at Zain, and it doesn't stop there. He's an advisor to the Stephen Covey Institute in Utah, Governor of the M-Pesa Academy in Nairobi, Kenya, and a trustee of the Africa Philanthropic, I always struggle with that word, Foundation. And of course, all round, a great guy. Welcome.
You have a great memory.
I try. I've been trying all day.
You worked on that.
I've been working on that all day, I tell you. How do you even respond when the average person asks you, what do you do? Because you're a man that wears so many hats.
I always say I'm a father and a friend.
Father and a friend. That's beautiful.
Then if they ask, but what do you do? And then I say, okay, you really want the list?
Thank you so much for taking your time out to be with us.
It's an important
today.
issue, very important.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're gathered here to talk about, of course, racial injustice in light of recent atrocities that we have seen, namely so the George Floyd incident. When you saw that video, when you heard about that, what was your response? What came to mind? How did you feel?
I had tears. I watched it over and over and over again because you're trying to understand, is this really 8 minutes and 45 seconds or is this an edited clip? Is this stretched? What has gone on here? And I think everybody has felt this phenomenal depression impact.
Yeah.
Since May the 25th. We've been bombarded with videos of tragedy after tragedy after tragedy of where police and security services have abused the public, have damaged and destroyed their public office duties, have shown themselves to be contemptible of the law that they're meant to protect and provide. But we've actually witnessed young lives, young black girls turned over, rolled over by the police as though they were some kind of venomous animal. We've seen dogs holding on to men's arms and legs and police incapable of removing them, maybe because they don't want to remove them. But we've also seen that the perilous nastiness, the vile nature of that murder, which has to be, in my judgment, a category 1 murder, because you cannot stay for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and not know what you are doing.
Sure.
So even if he had not started with the intention, halfway through, you know that's what you're going to do.
Absolutely.
There was an intention to kill.
Yes.
And we now discover that there was previous skirmishes in relationship between the police officer, former police officer, and George Floyd. They'd worked together in a nightclub somewhere, so there was historic resentment.
Right.
Now there is a motive.
Yes.
And all of us have gone through rage and depression, fear, and that sense of if this doesn't break, and if the transformation doesn't happen, what are the consequences?
Sure.
Then for the next one and the next one and the next one. And even watching, as we've all done, the way in which police in New York and police in Washington and police in Los Angeles and police in other American cities attempted to besmirch the public who were out protesting.
Yes.
Even assaulting the public who are out protesting, telling you that there's a kind of instinctive right felt amongst American police officers that they can persecute you if you are black, if you're of a minority culture, or if you're seen to be inadequate in their eyes. They can persecute you. And somehow, because of the potency of these incredibly unjust police unions and a careless White House with no intrinsic interest in justice, they know they thought they knew they could get away with it.
Sure.
And obviously, the House of Representatives is doing their thing. Will the Senate in America follow suit? We don't know. But I suppose if you're saying, how do we feel I mean, we're not at the end of this. We've just had the funeral this week. There have been 3 memorials. I watched all 3 memorials. I watched the 4 hours of the funeral the other day. I've stayed on this story all the way through because this isn't a news event.
Yes. Yeah.
This is the destruction of a whole man's future.
Yeah.
His children, his grandchildren, his relatives have watched him snuffed out in front of their eyes, and the world has seen it, and all the reaction in every major city of the world. And you know what? The one image which got me the most was the image in Idlib in Syria, of a wall painting of George Floyd in the middle of a completely destroyed war building.
Wow.
Now, that is a war of catastrophic impact that has gone on now for 8 years, where hundreds of thousands of people have lost lives and property and the destruction of a whole country, and yet they remembered George Floyd. That tells you how serious the message has gone out.
Absolutely.
And the fear that is what is meant to be, in some ways, the beacon of world democracy and world freedom, and the promise of equality has been trashed before our eyes.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for the mayor of New York, who's allowed Black Lives Matter to be painted in yellow on that street so that the president could look out of his window and see it every single time. But it also has the additional commitment, defund the police. Now, that's a very political thing to discuss, but if you've got to use a weapon to transform police behavior, there's nothing that changes behavior quite like taking money away.
Right.
Because when money is gone, all of a sudden those who are the chiefs in charge, who may have been complacent or indifferent or careless about this, begin to realize they're not having their bonuses, their paychecks, their enjoyments, their golf tours. All of that's out the window. I would support a transformation of the economy of American policing, let alone our own. Accountability issues are at the center of this solution.
That's a very vital and valid point that you've mentioned in and amongst everything that you've just said, and which I actually want to come on to in a moment. I guess what I want to ask is, you mentioned about the image of George Floyd in places like Syria. We've seen protests in places like Korea, South Korea, Australia and the like. But racism isn't new. It was before your lifetime, certainly before my lifetime. I mean, I was born in the 80s, and even within that decade, we're seeing riots in the places like Bristol, Birmingham, to name a few. What is it about this incident that has sparked such a response?
I think probably 2 things more than anything else. The length of it.
Okay.
We've seen snapshots of video of a man being mauled or a shooting.
Yeah.
But the length of the torture to death, we've not watched that before. And for that to have been carried hundreds of millions of times now on media, social media platforms, and by public broadcasters, the whole 8 minutes, 46 seconds, that's a very long time. Some people struggle when we come round to remembering the wars to stand for a minute or 2 minutes in silence.
Yeah.
To kneel for 8 minutes, 46 seconds. The New York Stock Exchange on the day of the funeral, just the other day, paused for 8 minutes, 46 seconds.
Wow.
Members of the House of Representatives knelt for 8 minutes, 46 seconds. In Parliament here in Westminster, both in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, we stood for a minute's silence to remember George Floyd. The fact that this man's name is spoken in the British Parliament repeatedly and in every corner of the world. So there is that sense that we watched something which you thought would be in a film of fantasy.
Sure.
But even in a film of fantasy, you never see a killing taking that long.
Yeah.
That long.
Yeah.
I think that is one reason for it. I think the second thing is the Economist had a remarkable obituary of his life. And The Economist doesn't just feature anybody, because this is their major magazine of news record, world record. And to feature George Floyd last week, first week of June, and obviously he had a complicated life.
Yeah.
He'd been to prison a number of times.
Sure.
He got caught up in criminal circuits. But this was a young man who his own teacher spoke about in one of the memorials, who said from when he was a little child, I want to change the world for the freedom of my people. He knew that before he was even a teenager. And when he was a teenager, he repeated those sentiments. Here is a guy who had the vision within his bones that he would contribute significantly to world transformation. And I think that has been unleashed around, it's almost like a spiritual thing, has been unleashed. We've all said, wow, the shock of the length of it, but then this is the moment where the opportunity becomes real. And everything moves from just occasional protests, that's an American problem, into this is everybody's drama.
Right.
This is everybody's pain. This is everybody's grief.
Talking about it being everybody's grief, we've seen people from various different countries, as I mentioned, and nationalities protesting. We've seen black people, of course, we've seen white people, we've seen Asian people taking a kneel, pausing for a moment to reflect on what we've seen. In light of protests, in light of statues being removed, we have seen some conversations begin to happen. But I guess there is a fear as to whether these protests, these petitions, are enough, and whether this is going to be a thing where, give it a number of weeks, a couple of months, everything will just phase back into normal, nothing is done, and it will be forgotten about. What is your response to those kind of thoughts?
Well, I reflect on the fact that the bus boycott, which came about as a result of Rosa Parks not willing to sit at the back, was 381 days. You know, that's 20 days longer than a year that black people across the southern parts of the US walked relentlessly, taxied relentlessly, supported each other relentlessly not to use the bus system to ensure change happened.
Sure.
And if these protests were to continue for 381 days, I think we would have been spellbound by a new kind of robust energy. I suspect we won't be going that long, but it is to note that real systemic transformation never happens quickly.
Right.
You know, here we are outside the Palace of Westminster, both chambers of this Parliament, 210 years ago, were embroiled in the battle of a lifetime for William Wilberforce, who gave 44 years of his life to get one particular statute through Parliament and one bill to fund the eradication of slavery. 44 years, 9 times the legislation failed because of indifference and disagreement. He kept on bringing it back. He became an MP at the age of 20 and he died 3 days after. He finished getting the money necessary to liberate the black slaves. And this was a young man, white, educated, privileged, who with so many others were determined on the long journey of transformation. You know, this year we're sitting in now, 2020, we're 52 years on from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And look what remains unresolved. Look what is unfinished. Look at the aspects of the dream that are not done yet. So for anyone to say, okay, we're going to do a couple of weeks protest and then we'll take a few statues down and that's kind of done it, is meaningless energy that is dissipated. I watched the mayor of New York, the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, make the powerful point that he made, as did so many, I would say, seasoned black activists. Al Sharpton said exactly the same in the funeral service yesterday, that what is essential here is to make sure that every person who has an electoral mandate, so anybody who is in position of authority and power, whether it's local or regional or national, knows in the US, knows here in the UK, that the activism is going to be generated with inclusive determination at the ballot box.
Right.
That people will stand for candidates of justice. They will take out candidates of injustice. That they will prepare young men and women to become local authority and local authority candidates, and to become elected members of parliament, and to stand to become senior members of the police service, and to stand in all the areas of probation and prisons and courts and the criminal justice system. If we don't seek to populate the places which affect the people who've been most affected by discrimination. All we'll do is protest and wail on the edges. We've got to be prepared to get ourselves in at the center of the inclusive places that require our energy, but to do so with huge intelligence. And I have two commitments I would love to see done. Right. And I put this to you as a pastor of a church and any other church who cares to watch. Two things I'd love to see done. Number one, in order to get high quality candidates standing for political office in this country, in the United Kingdom, we need to fund their development.
Right.
We need to fund their education, we need to fund their development, we need to fund their experience, we need to support them through the process, we need to get the best skills imbibed into their being, and we need to get mentors around them. We're going to take them through the track, and if it takes them 10 years to get there, wouldn't it be marvelous to say we invested all of that to get them to the point where they became the decision maker,
right,
where they rise to a position where they can affect the flick of a switch that sets people free. So we've got to be prepared to put money in to make sure the right people get to the best places.
Right.
Number one. Number two, the funding system in this country, the funding system to help miscarriages of justice is absolutely flat on the floor.
Right.
If anyone has been trounced by the police, damaged in the criminal justice system, misheard by the courts, how are they going to get any form of legal aid to take that case for review? They can't get it.
Yep. So
there needs to be a fighting fund that supports civil cases by families who are willing to take their case forward, funded by church groups and others, as a matter of justice. And if justice is seen to be done in and around our communities because we're willing to pay for it.
Yep.
You see, walking may hurt our feet after a couple of hours. And if we do it for a few months, it'll probably hurt our feet extensively. But what really counts is what hurts our pockets.
Right.
So the money to back cases, to get behind families who fear for injustice done to them, and to actually bring the police to account, and the money to back people, young girls, young men, to get into the criminal justice system, to get into the policing system, to get into the political system, to get into the legal system, and stand behind them for the rest of our lives. That is what's so important. We do these things, we'll have made a change. Now then we need, and let's be candid about it, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, said it exactly right. If the majority white community in America and here in the UK, remembering the black community here is just 4% of the population, add in the Asian community, you're at 8% of the population, meaning that well over 90% are not like us. So if that's the reality, the people who've got the levers to deliver change are the white majority community. They are our allies, our friends, our partners, our brothers, our sisters. They're out marching just the same. They're out feeling just the same. This isn't just a black issue. This is a freedom, justice, humanity issue. Those people who are allies, who have the levers of power, we need them.
Absolutely.
We mustn't alienate them. We need them. And we need to work together to deliver that common justice that they now equally agree upon. And I would say that it is also fundamental in this country, in the UK, that we come away from this notion of the independent right of the police to determine operational procedures.
Right.
Because that means, in effect, that politicians who have the levers of economy and so-called law may well advise, but the police can decide their operation. Right. How do we control that? That simply means it becomes acceptable to continue with practices which can disadvantage. That needs to end.
I want to pick up on something that you just mentioned about funding and supporting cases where, let's say, a family is scared to go forward because of what it might do to them, or might not be in a position financially, for example, to get the justice that they deserve. And the reason why I want to pick up on that is because I remember coming to you and having a conversation with you around November last year. And I discussed with you a project that I had been working on, and it's a project about supporting black people even before we've seen many of the things that we're seeing today. And I remember you specifically telling me how great you found the idea was, and willing to back it and be behind it and so on and so forth. But I vividly remember you saying one of the biggest challenges that I will have is getting my fellow black brothers and sisters to contribute to that. So how can we actively create change out there if a kingdom divided amongst itself cannot stand, if I was to use that term? I was interviewed last week about black people coming together and fighting injustice. But my question is, how can we do that if the black brother is jealous of their fellow black brother getting ahead of them or quote unquote ahead of them in life. Does it start with us first before we can think about engaging in conversation with the people you mentioned?
Well, you raise the nub of the issue, especially for the church, because when Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, remember, resisted by Peter, as ever,
Yes.
but then eventually, he happily, without social distancing, washes the feet of his disciples, and he says, I have set you an example. And what does that example physically show us? He had to be on his knees. He had to take a bowl and water and wash their feet. In other words, he humbled himself and sacrificed his own position as Lord, King and Master in order to wash their feet. Here is the challenge to the churches. If there was genuine economic audit of what were the resources available to churches working together to deliver the funding needed for the program you brought to me last year, for funding the cases that we've talked about, let's thank God that we saw at the Easter weekend the UK Blessing. Beautiful. A phenomenal piece of musical artistry coming from over 30 different types of churches around the UK, and black churches and Pentecostal churches and high Anglican churches and all white churches, and you name them. A blessing which of course became the absolute trending piece of music on Easter Sunday. Wonderful. So if that can be coordinated to do a piece of music, can't we coordinate the resourcing of exactly the program that you discussed? And can't we get behind the families who feel that they're at their wits' end for pleading because nothing is coming forward to fund the case that they need to take forward? They cannot get justice for their son who was severely mishandled by a police group in whatever the occasion might have been, and it's important to secure the justice. Now, if you were to audit the accounts, I'm afraid this comes down to leaders as well, like you, or audit the accounts of everybody involved in the church in the way that follows on the Acts 2 principle that they held all things in common. And you audited the resources of the church, and you therefore made a genuine, if you say tithing amount at 10% and a gifting amount that takes you to 20%, we'd have the resources. The truth is people don't give, they're mean-spirited and they're self-centered. And they do that saying in the name of Jesus and sticking their hands in the air. So what I'm absolutely robust about is this. If you don't put the real resources behind the things you say you believe in, you don't believe in them.
Absolutely.
And going around marching and tipping over statues and all those kind of things achieves no change. Marching is vital to express anguish. Some statues need to be removed, which are a statement of too much historic, vile behavior. But just moving things and marching won't change. Money changes things, and power positions change things. And that's what we've got to work towards.
Absolutely. Anything else we can do? You highlighted earlier on in our discussion something about defunding the police. And I said I'll come back to you on that. Aside from the wonderful tips and pointers that you've given us, which I hope all of the viewers will take on board, because it's one thing to hear a thing, it's another thing to do a thing. Is there anything else we can do during this particular time to play our part towards creating change?
So let me just say one thing on that defunding the police, which is, of course, is an American idea. And it started off in Minneapolis, of course, which is where George Floyd was killed, and it's moved into defunding the New York police and defunding the Washington police and defunding the Los Angeles police and so on. Why is that an important trigger? Because as we mentioned before, if police services have to account for how resources are used when actions of discrimination are part of general funding, they will have to think again. So there needs to be specific accountability for if the UK government here insists, for example, on continuing the program of stop and search, which is 4 times more discriminatory against black young men than it is against white young men, insists on it, let us see the funding that goes into that, and let's pare it down so we can actually deliver outcome results. Because we know on the basis of stop and search that well over 80% of stop and searches deliver no criminal activity. So this is an expenditure which is not delivering the meaningful result that they say it delivers. Therefore, let's make the accountability for expenditure vivid, real and transparent. And it's important for those who are the chairs of police authorities and those who are the commissioners for police and those who are responsible for funding to look at these things pragmatically. Now, I am absolutely 100% in favour and behind making sure we have a well-funded, robust criminal justice system, including the police, including prison service needs, including courts. But if that is used
Yeah.
for discrimination, there should be a price to pay.
Sure.
And that price to pay should fall on the chiefs of police. It should fall on the senior officers, because after all, the direction given to junior officers comes from the senior ones. That price should be economic. If you're the boss of a big company and your company fails, no bonus and cut to salary. Does that apply when that comes to the behaviors of individual police services? Well, in fact, it doesn't. Therefore, it should. And we got to make accountability transparent and financially responsible. Now, the other thing I feel we should absolutely drive very hard to do, besides backing the cases of those trounced by the system or feeling severe injustice, we actually have to build up such a coterie of positive, credible, intelligent, engaged black social and political and educational and health presence. We've celebrated weeks now of health workers, of bus drivers, of nurses and doctors from different ethnic cultures who've given themselves to ensure the livelihoods of others are safe and secure. Fantastic, wonderful. We all celebrate their skills and their professionalism and the gift of who they are. But you know, our country is layered full of remarkable young black men and women who are doing incredible jobs of generosity and service, and those stories need to get out.
Yeah.
We need to see them. Yes, we need to see them on the front pages of newspapers, and we need to see them on major television programs, but we need to actively promote the interest of good news rather than allowing, as social media does, the perpetration of negative news.
Right.
And constantly going on about celebrities and significances and glamour things that people want. Let's go on about the glamour of the light that is seen in people's lives. Let's bring out these remarkable people whose energy is all about building secure society. You know, let's take very clearly the verses at the beginning of the book of Jeremiah 29, which makes it so clear that if you pray for and you build the peace and prosperity of the city you live in, it will go well for you. And that is where we should put our energy, into making sure our cities are genuinely safe for all, genuinely prosperous for all, bring out the good news of everything that every great black person is doing. Let's help those who are struggling. Let's support those who need to get involved in political and economic and judicial life. Let's get behind them. Let's pay the price of making these things happen. And this isn't about sticking our hands in the air and jumping on our knees. This is about putting our hands in our pockets.
Absolutely.
And that will make the difference.
Finally, Lord Hastings, what do you say to people at a time where Black Lives Matters, who say all lives matter?
Of course all lives matter. There's no question about that. You know, one of the greatest reformers this country's ever known, whether it's Wilberforce or Shaftesbury, those two between them also created the Royal Society for the Protection of Animals. They also created the Royal Society for the Protection of Children. So children's lives matter, animals' lives matter, wildlife matters, environmental life matters, black lives matter, Chinese lives matter, white lives matter, all life matters. But the reason Black Lives Matters is a significant statement, not just for now, but for history, is that our lives have mattered less. And when it comes to the places where both economy and power reside, we've not been in the center of those conversations. You know, it's one thing to see a man come to the presidency of the United States, for which we say thank God, but look at the resistance of the system towards him over those 8 years, how difficult it is to achieve change. And actually 8 years is too short. It's too short. And here the people of America have a choice to make now. On November the 4th this year, they will have to choose how they vote. I remember way back in the 1980s, because I'm way older than you, way back in the 1980s, I was born in the 50s, remember that? Way back in the 1980s, when I was asked to address Martin Luther King Day at the American Servicemen Centre in Scotland, where one of the American nuclear subs was based, and there were 300 black young officers in front of me, and I was speaking to them on Martin Luther King Day, and I asked them, with a US presidential election coming up, the one that brought Ronald Reagan into office, I asked them how many of them had registered to vote. Less than 20% of hands went up. Because you see, the freedom that was bought for them by Martin Luther King's sacrifice had come to mean almost nothing
Sure.
2 decades later. But that's because they've made it mean nothing.
Right.
It must mean everything, that every young person in your church, every young person you can influence, that I can influence, must register to vote, must participate in democratic systems, must get involved in understanding how money is devised and spent, must ask questions on local authority councils, must be involved in planning issues, must take time to understand the structures of the police, must be involved in supporting people through the courts, must back people so justice is well done, must support prisoners inside, must do what Jesus said to do. When all these things were going on, you came, you were there, you visited, you fed, you supported, you housed. If we don't do that, it's a denial of his life.
Lord Hastings, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it, guys. I hope you've really been encouraged. I hope you've been challenged. Black Lives Matter, but we must do more. We can't stop here, and there's still ground to take. Until next time, let's keep doing more. Let's keep pushing on.